Greetings YouTube, Captain Machine here, back for another review, and this is a review I've been threatening to do for a long while. When I say threaten, you may see what I mean in a moment's time. Today we're going to be talking about SLA Industries, and I must point out this is the originator, this is where it all came from. This is by Nightfall Games, but I believe it's now published by Cubicle 7. Cubicle 7, by the way, does some fantastic work at the moment in RPGs, especially with their CoreRules Britannia line. I'll talk about that when I get my hands on it. But this is what we're talking about today. This is the originator, and what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to review all of the books that have come out for this. There's not many of them, so it's not going to take a long time to go through them. A bit like what I did with my Delta Green stuff. But I'm going to treat it in the way that I'm going to review each book on the strength of itself, primarily, and then of every book that's came out before that, not the book that will come out after, because some of the later books are particularly better than this, but they're not going to get mentioned until we get to those points in the actual history. This has been around for quite some time, and it's got a bit of a cult following. There's a fair few people in the RPG brigade who do enjoy this game to one extent or another, myself included. I've been introduced by this purely by word of mouth from another games master in the past, and I've taken it upon myself to run it from time to time, and people seem to enjoy it. It advertises itself on the back of the book as a role-playing game of futuristic urban horror. I'm not quite sure if you can see that, because I'm trying this new setup. I'm not sure if the lighting's working. Let me know what you think, guys. I think it'd be a bit more interesting seeing the mess which is my room as a background. And basically I feel that, at least in the horror aspect of it, it fails. I'm really, really upset to say this. Well, I'm going to break it down for you. Go to my SLA Industries review of the Savage World version of the rulebook, link down below, and that will explain the background to it, although I'm going to briefly go into it here, because ultimately what you're dealing with here is a nondescript futuristic environment where there's very little connection to the modern world, as it were. It's a bit like Star Wars in the fact that there's no originator. Everything takes place in Mort City. You can of course leave Mort City and go to other planets and other worlds and other cities to game, but it's not particularly well covered as to what happens when you do that. That's kind of up to the GM to decide. Ultimately what you play as operatives. These are basically private contractors for SLA Industries, and you deal with the stuff that the regular police force couldn't do. You know, counterinsurgency, terrorism, stuff like that, you know, assassinations, retrievals, guarding things of particular import. You get the idea, and you get paid per mission to do it, and you get that money and you pay off your, obviously, your rent. You buy your bullets, which are horrendously expensive due to something called the bullet tax. The bullet tax in turn promotes close combat, which is much more, shall we say, television friendly, because ultimately what you want to do is get yourself on television, get yourself on Third Eye News, and then from there you can become famous, because in this universe 98% of the populace is unemployed. They do nothing but watch television all day, and as such, if you can become a reality TV star, which is a little something that they predicted well ahead of its time, you can make it big. You can get the better contracts, buy the bigger guns, have the better armour, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, what I've described to you so far is a bit of dystopian future mixed with Gun Bunny, and that's ultimately how it comes off. There is mentions in passing to various bits. I mean, as it says on the back, here we go. Life is cheap, but knowledge will cost you more than you can imagine. Guns kill, but so does the truth. Okay, granted, there's a bit of like ooh to that, and there's a bit of ooh in the text as well. It's like, what is the truth? Or, you know, it's obviously not mentioned in a particular case. The idea is you're supposed to make it up yourself. There is a document online that you can find. You can Google it. I'm not going to point you to it. If you want to Google it, there is something called The Truth for SLA Industries, and ultimately it was rumoured to be the original design concept for the game, and reading it, I can't see how. It might have been like the little daydream of the writer back in the day, but ultimately it's something that the player characters could never learn, never comprehend, never grasp, or never deal with, so what's the point in including it? I'm pretty sure that when they wrote it and they reviewed it, back when they first started developing this game, they went, actually, yeah, this is kind of crap. So the truth, as it were, is up in the air. Me personally, I like to think that Mr. Slayer is a bit like an avatar of Nyarlathotep, if you're into your Cthulhu mythos stuff, who basically just enjoys making people's lives crap. And ultimately you have to deal with that. That's kind of what I aim for when I run it. And there is supposed to be a supernatural element included with it, but there's very little gone into this, with the exception of the ebb users, which are basically your psychics or your spellcasters in any other setting, basically, or even your Jedi if you want to get Star Warsy. The rule set themselves works off a basic fundamental 2d10 plus your skill point. So say for example, and you always have to get 11 to score anything. So say for example, you've got a gun skill of 1 and you roll 2d10. You have to get 10 or more, and that's 2d10, to succeed. And I'd like to point out that the skill goes from 1, which is practically untrained, to like, I barely know which end to point the gun at, to 10, which is I am the Olympic gold medalist. And you may, if you're a bit of a mathematician like me, realise the problem with that immediately. It's too easy. I mean, statistically speaking, even at skill level 1, you're very, very likely to actually succeed. I'm not aware of the actual percentages. If I do work it out, I'll plonk it about here. But ultimately, it's something that the game, in my opinion, is hampered by. An average operative, from my experience, will tend to have a skill level around 5 to 8. And when you've got a 5 to 8 and your target number is 11 on 2d10, your chances of failure are minimal, absolutely minimal, to the point where the GM has to invent scenarios and invent situations which implies minuses to that. Add on top of that a combat system which is clunky, and a wound system which encourages you to take damage when you get shot, even if the shot doesn't penetrate your armour, due to blunt force trauma. So effectively what could happen, if you're using all the rules as they're written, that you could walk into down the street in power armour, practically a miniature dreadnought or walking tank preferably, and you get shot by a group of kids with the lowest grade weapons in the game, and due to sheer massive firepower they will not kill you. Because each hit, whether or not it causes damage, whether or not it damages your armour in any case, will cause you wounds which you have to heal, and so on and so forth. There is a very interesting mechanic behind it with regards to your calibre of your weapons, because the weapon itself, the calibre, and also the type of ammunition, because you've got your standard, your armor penetration, your explosive, your armor high explosive, armor penetrating, and so on and so forth. Lots of different kinds of bullets you can buy for your guns, which ramp up the price quite considerably, but all damage has a fixed value. Granted, you can increase that value by your degrees of success in terms of your attack and your dice roll. But ultimately, if you shoot somebody, you'll know that you'll do X amount of damage per shot, minus of course any armour they've got. But once you come across the situation where you're dealing with, say, the same creature over and over again, like you're attacked by a lot of carrion, which are like basically the vermin of the city, you will know categorically how many shots you need and where to place that shot in order to actually kill them in 1 or 2 shots. And it kind of, well, it's a clunky mechanic which is acceptable in the time it was written, really is, but hasn't aged well at all. The curve, if you want to call it, the probability curve of the whole thing, is too skewed in the favour of the players, which encourages the GM to invent situations where you are less likely to succeed. Like, it's raining quite heavily, that's a -1. A couple of street lamps around, so it's a bit darker than normal, that's a -1. You know, it's pretty windy today, that's a -1. There's some explosions in the background which are a bit distracting, that's a -1. And so on and so forth. And ultimately it kind of bogs it down, really does. Also, you've got a variable dexterity system which determines how many actions you are allowed per round, kind of like how the Wiseman system does it, and ultimately the Wiseman system is also a system I don't enjoy, purely because it does the exact same thing. Whereas if you gimp yourself on one particular stat, in this case dexterity, you are effectively gimping your entire character, because you only get 1, possibly 2 actions compared to the 5 or 6 that your opponent does, purely because he's decided to have much higher dexterity. In fact, if you're playing a human, for example, the dexterity of that 3 or 4, you've got a couple of actions. Right? Your squad mate, who's decided to play someone with a much higher dexterity, maybe an alien race that has a dexterity bonus, they're going like 5 times around. I mean, it can feel like, oh, I'm kind of like, he's having more fun than I am because he's doing more things than I am, and so on and so forth. So there is that disadvantage to it as well. As a standalone product, as a book by itself, the setting is alright. It could do with more explanation of what the hell's going on. Nothing is concrete, nothing is set in stone, which granted does give you a lot of sandbox to play with. But when you've got almost nothing but sand in your sandbox, and you can't really build with it. That's a poor analogy, I do apologise for that. But I feel that the later books that come along later on do address some of the issues I've just brought up, but ultimately the rules are out of date, they're clunky, they're hard to run, both as a player and as a GM, especially as a GM. The damage is incredibly lethal for a game which is essentially incredibly combat heavy. It's not like Call of Cthulhu where, or even Dark Heresy, where you are discouraged from attacking or shooting things unless you absolutely have to, because you can potentially die in 1 or 2 shots. In this game you can die in 1 or 2 shots, but the game actively encourages you to go out and kill things. So it's this weird juxtapose between you have to kill things and you can die quite easily. To the point where last time around this game, as is in the book, they were hunting down a serial killer called Executioner who liked to chop people's heads off. So it gave him ridiculous minors for a cold shot, because he would always aim for your neck. That was the whole. He had this lovely, nice big axe, and basically he would always aim for your neck. And if you missed, he missed. Obviously, if you hit, it would do damage to your head location on the armour. Now, as with most decent role-playing systems that use hit locations, your head usually has the least amount of hit points in it, which is fair enough, that's fine. However, when you take into consideration his moderate strength and these moderately effective axe, he was one-shotting player characters. I actually killed 3 player characters in that session in the space of about 5 minutes. If it wasn't for the fact that one player had boned up both on the rules and his equipment, they would have all died, because basically what he did was he backed off and he got his gun out and he went and he aimed for centre mass, and he just basically drilled bullets into him, knowing full well how much damage he was causing per hit, because it's a fixed damage value system. So I would have to give this a 2 out of 5, and I'm only being that generous because it's a fantastically interesting background which I haven't seen reproduced in anywhere near the clarity that this has for a long time. Granted, I've played games past this which have weird backgrounds. I mean, after all, I'm a die-hard werewolf player, that's got a weird background to it. But this is hampered heavily by a weird background which is not very well defined, so you don't know for certain what's happening. When I say what is happening, I'm not talking about like the truth, I'm talking about day-to-day activities of life. You know, stuff like that, stuff that you need your bedding in. You need to be grounded in with the normality of the situation before you can give them the weird stuff. You need to know what is normal before you know what is weird.